The country is often described as a peaceful and wonderful place, but after the experience I had with my grandmother, I don't think of it as being very peaceful anymore. Just the opposite, actually. And it's because of the other things that live there. I was just your average teenage girl visiting her grandparents' house during summer break. I didn't think I'd be doing too much while I was there, mostly just helping my grandmother with her chores, like I had during other times. Anyways, my dad dropped me off at her house, and I was about to give her a hug when she suddenly shouted at me. "Don't take a single step forward! Stay back!" she cried out. Alarmed, I fell backwards and followed her eyes as she looked down. Creeping out of the bushes that were right next to her porch was a black cat with golden-looking eyes. I recognized that cat instantly because it was her cat named Ruffles. It's been a while since that day, but I could have sworn then, and could swear now, that I noticed her glaring at them. But she quickly stopped and started laughing out loud.
"I'm just pulling your leg," she giggled. "Yeah, real funny," I sarcastically laughed. But even though she'd gone back to being her usual cheerful, quirky self, I could tell that something wasn't quite right. As I was thinking that, my grandmother went back inside, and Ruffles rubbed against my leg affectionately. I picked her up and went inside after Grandma. As we were chatting energetically, she told me about the grand adventures she'd have while taking care of her garden. Personally, I've never cared much for plants, and I probably have the fastest record for killing one in less than a week. But I had to admit, my grandmother made it sound and feel fun. I remember laughing as she told me that one time she thought a wolf had hidden in one of her bushes as she was repotting a succulent outside. Now, before I go on, I need to let you know that her tone had gotten deeper and darker with every word. She told me that she thought she'd heard whimpering coming from it, and decided it must have been a dog. She approached it slowly, trying to calm it down. But when she was right in front of the bush, the sound suddenly stopped. She then heard the whimpering noise a bit farther away. Thinking that the animal could be hurt, she followed the sound around her house and went into her backyard. Being that she lives in the country, there's a lot of forest everywhere, and her backyard leads right into it. As she finally thought that she'd come closer to the source of the sound, once again it got farther and was coming straight from in the forest. She knew right then and there that something much more was going on. I remember how she told me it was like something was watching her, and how she felt uneasy being in her own backyard. And after she thought she heard the sound come closer to her again, she rushed back inside her house and stayed there all night. But she couldn't sleep a wink that night and kept hearing the same whimpering voice outside her bedroom window. And even though she thought that it was coming from like somewhere away, she could have sworn that she heard another noise, and it sounded like a person's voice calling out her name. Like something straight out of a horror movie, and I honestly couldn't believe it. I just brushed it off as one of her stories and told her that she had a big imagination. She laughed and agreed, going off to the kitchen to make me some lunch, and I spent some quality time with Ruffles. As I was petting her and giving her belly rubs, I saw something dark on my hand that felt wet. I brought it up to my face and gasped in surprise. "Grandma! Grandma! I think Ruffles hurt herself." I sat her down on the couch and pushed Grandma over to where she was, but they were gone. I showed her my hand, and she looked at it in some kind of daze. Then she went back into the kitchen as though I'd said nothing, and I sat back down stunned, wondering what her silence meant. It got darker, and my grandmother finally finished making dinner. We sat at the table in a new silence that I wasn't used to from her. Then she got up, pushed back the window blinds from the kitchen window, looked through, let them fall back, and walked over to me. and in a somewhat faint voice, she spoke. "Ruffles is definitely outside again. If you see her, don't let her in." "What? What are you saying? She's always allowed in," I replied. My grandmother shook her head, and I could feel the tension in the room grow. I asked her why she said that, and she didn't answer. Then I asked her again, and she shut her eyes, not saying anything. Furious, I told her that if she didn't tell me, I would let her back in. And the second after I said that, she shouted out the one thing I would never have been prepared to hear. "Because that's not Ruffles." Blood drained from me. I felt cold and frail. I fumbled my words as I tried to ask her what she meant, and was as frozen as a statue. "Do you know what a SkinWalker is?" my grandmother asked. I shook my head, and she told me that apparently they're monsters that take the skin of other animals and wear them. She told me that that's all she knew about them, and that they were dangerous creatures that lived around her house. At first, she didn't know what to think of the strange noises she heard, but then she heard from the few neighbors miles away from her about them, and that was when she understood. "So, you're saying that a SkinWalker to Ruffles?" I was trying hard not to say the words I really didn't want to hear, but I knew that I could never escape from the truth. Having no strength to stay up, after hearing what happened to Ruffles, I went off to the room I'd be sleeping in. It was right next to my grandmother's, and it had a window right across my bed. That night, I tossed and turned and had horrible nightmares about Ruffles. I had even woken up and thought I saw Ruffles, no, the SkinWalker, using Ruffles' eyes to stare at me through the bedroom window. But I passed out too quickly to really know. All I can confirm is that I felt like I was really sick. A few days passed, and neither Grandma nor me had seen the missing cat. Nothing creepy happened, and it was nice to finally have some good days. The next day, I packed up my stuff as I was waiting for Dad to come pick me up. I gave a hug goodbye to my grandmother and was about to go into the car when I mysteriously stopped. I really can't explain why I suddenly stopped. It's like my body sensed something and immediately reacted to it. I turned to face the forest and saw Ruffles crouched down next to a tree, staring intently at me. It's like the eyes were staring into my very being, but for some reason I didn't feel fear. "Goodbye, Ruffles," I whispered. I waved a quick goodbye, not to the SkinWalker, but to her. She had been a great cat, and I would never forget her. I got in the car, and as Dad drove away, I watched my grandmother smiling. "See you," she yelled. But I noticed something. She had never opened her mouth once. She had just been waving. So I'm guessing it must have come from it, the SkinWalker. Nowadays, I make sure to visit as much as possible, mostly for my grandmother's sake. So far, I haven't been having any other encounters with it. But why would I? I would hope for anybody the country remains a peaceful, amazing place, because they are out there and they are extremely dangerous. That's another story done. Thanks for taking the time to listen to it, and hopefully you had a good experience. See you on the flip side.